Hello and welcome to The Deep Dive. I'm Vlad and I host the Not Me podcast hosted on Vlad's newsletter. We're here today to take a really definitive look at maybe the largest and most foundational shift in consumer tech since, I don't know, the mobile internet maybe. We are talking about the LLM revolution, and specifically, we are diving deep into some pretty unprecedented internal data from OpenAI. You know, for the last couple of years, we've all navigated this endless speculation, right? Market hype, surveys about ChatGPT, how these large language models are changing everything. But today, we're actually moving past the speculation. We're getting into the facts. We're analyzing this monumental economic research paper. And the key thing is it used internal privacy-preserving data directly from OpenAI, tracking consumer usage right from the launch, November 2022, all the way through July 2025. And the scale of this data, it's just staggering, really. We're talking about classifying the intent behind billions of messages from over 700 million users across the globe. So the big question we're tackling today is pretty fundamental.
Despite this, explosive, completely unprecedented adoption, how are people really using these LLMs? Is it like a cheap way to automate work, a shortcut for coding, maybe an emotional companion, or is it something else entirely? And to help us synthesize this massive, really complex data set and connect these usage patterns to the bigger economic picture, I have my expert guide here, the person who can, spot the patterns in the data where the rest of us might just see noise.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a real privilege to dive into this material. This study, the one led by researchers like Bick and others, it gives us this rare objective window into tech diffusion happening at a speed we've just never seen before. We're moving beyond anecdotes now, beyond just surveys. We're not just looking at adoption numbers. We're seeing classified behavioral shifts directly from the input data itself. And that gives us a much, much cleaner view of what consumers actually prefer, what people do, not just what they say they do.
Right. So our mission today is clear. We want to give you, our listener, the learner, the clearest possible understanding of, first, the sheer scale of this thing, this diffusion. Second, the surprising distribution of usage, and it really does challenge this sort of standard economic story. And third, where the actual quantified economic value is being created, both at work and maybe surprisingly, overwhelmingly outside of work.
Okay, let's just jump right into the numbers then, because honestly, they're so enormous they almost defy categorization. We're talking about a velocity of diffusion, a speed that the researchers themselves explicitly state has no precedent.
That's absolutely this starting point. And it's crucial to grasp the sheer magnitude here. By July 2025, right, ChatGPT had been adopted by around 10% of the entire world's adult population. That translates to over 700 million users globally.
10%, wow. Yeah. And if you try to compare that rate to, say, how quickly smartphones spread or social media or even the internet itself, this speed is just historically completely unmatched. And to put the volume, the sheer activity into perspective, think about this. By July 2025, users were collectively sending 18 billion messages every single week.
18 billion a week.
Per week. So if you break that down, you're looking at roughly 2.5 billion messages being sent every single day.
2.5 billion messages daily.
Daily. This is a technology that, in less than 3 years, basically embedded itself into the daily thinking process of hundreds of millions of people worldwide.
Okay, but, it's one thing to get a lot of people to try something new quickly.
Yeah.
Especially with all the hype.
Yeah.
The real test, though, for a technology to be truly sticky is whether those users actually stick around.
Right.
I think the common assumption maybe for a product like this with such intense initial media coverage was, a huge surge at the start, then a massive drop off. The novelty wears off.
Exactly. And that's precisely where the data about these user cohorts, groups of users who signed up around the same time, gets really, really interesting. And it strongly supports the idea that this tech has long-term utility. Growth isn't just coming from a constant stream of new people signing up. Critically, it's also driven by the existing user cohorts actually increasing their usage over time, year after year. So the paper tracked these early cohorts, the people who signed up in the first few months, say Q1 2023. And yeah, their usage did kind of predictably dip a bit initially during 2023 after that first wave of excitement. But then usage started climbing again all through 2024. And by mid-2025, the researchers found something quite remarkable. These very first users, they were actually sending more messages than they were during that initial peak boom period.
Okay, wait. Let's unpack that finding for a second, because that suggests something really vital about the platform itself, doesn't it? It means the first users didn't just quit when the novelty wore off. They actually found better ways to use it, deeper ways, maybe more integrated ways as the models got better.
That's exactly what it suggests. It points to this continuous discovery process, probably driven by improvements in the AI itself. As the models get smarter, faster, maybe offer new features, users aren't just doing the same old tasks more often. They seem to be finding entirely new use cases, integrating the LLM deeper into how they make decisions, how they solve problems. And that indicates, a really robust embedded technology, one that adapts its utility over time. It gets more useful, not less.
So beyond just the sheer volume, the demographics, they tell a really compelling story too, right, about how this is spreading globally. And I remember one of the most talked about initial observations was that huge gender imbalance right at the launch.
Oh, yeah, it was a substantial skew, very noticeable. Early adopters were highly disproportionately male. In those first few months after launch, the researchers used this name-gender association analysis we can talk about that maybe is a bureau, and based on that, about 80% of active users had typically masculine first names.
80%. That's a massive initial gap for, well, half the population.
Before we get to the results, can you quickly explain that method? How do they figure out gender from just, privacy-preserving message data?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it highlights the challenges, right, of working with privacy-protected data. You can't just ask. So they use a standard technique. It's called name-gender association. Basically, they analyze the first names users provide. Then they statistically assign a probability of that name being typically masculine or typically feminine. And they base this on large regional databases of name prevalence. But critically, they don't use this to label any single individual user. That would be unreliable and invasive. Instead, they use it to look at the aggregate trends across millions of users. So while there's always, a small potential for error, especially with diverse global names, it gives a pretty strong indicator of the overall demographic skew in the user base.
Okay, that makes sense. So given that method, what did they find happened to that 80% male skew over time? Did it just stay that way? No, it closed dramatically. By June 2025, that figure, the share of typically masculine first names, it dropped all the way down to near parity. It reached 48%.
48%, so almost 50-50.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Which is arguably one of the fastest demographic rebalancings we've ever seen for a major technology platform. It happened incredibly quickly.
Wow. And was this closing gap linked to specific types of usage? Did the way people used it change as the demographics shifted?
Yes, absolutely. The researchers looked into the behavioral differences. They found that users with typically feminine names were, relatively speaking, more likely to use ChatGPT for things like writing assistance and practical guidance. Whereas users with typically male names tended to favor technical help, like coding questions, seeking information, and also multimedia content generation. So that closing gender gap seems to coincide with the moment when writing and practical guidance really became the dominant mass market use cases, moving beyond the initial tech-heavy focus.
Ah, okay. So the technology itself kind of matured, didn't it? Away from maybe niche technical stuff towards more generalized cognitive support. And that broadened the appeal, pulling in a much wider demographic. That makes perfect sense.
Precisely. Now, turning to age, this is still very much a young person's technology. That hasn't changed as dramatically. Nearly half of all messages, 46%, came from users aged 18 to 25. While that age gap has narrowed slightly over time, the core engine of adoption is definitely driven by younger, digitally native adults.
Okay. And what about the global picture? We talked about 700 million users worldwide. Is this just a phenomenon in rich countries, or is the diffusion happening everywhere?
This is perhaps one of the most socially significant findings in this first section of the research. ChatGPT usage actually grew faster over the last year in low and middle income countries. Specifically, they looked at countries with a GDP per capita roughly between $10,000 and $40,000 US dollars. The growth rate there outpaced growth in high income countries.
That's a really critical piece of data, isn't it? Why would that be the case? Any theories?
Well, it suggests that the value proposition, what people get out of it, might be even higher, where access to traditional, often expensive, customized expertise is more limited. Think about things like private tutors, specialized consultants, or even just access to deep research resources. In places where those things are less available or affordable, the LLM potentially acts as a kind of democratizing force. It provides instant, personalized knowledge assistance that might have been previously completely inaccessible or unaffordable for many people. Okay, so that scale and spread brings us right to the core analysis. What are people actually doing with those billions of messages? The researchers used this custom-built, privacy-preserving automated pipeline It involves sophisticated LLM-based classifiers to categorize user intent, and this allowed them to assign every single conversation to a specific task category. And the results, well, they fundamentally challenge that prevailing economic narrative about AI, the one focused almost entirely on workplace productivity.
Okay, can we just pause there for a second? Because that sounds highly technical. How can an LLM classify another LLM's conversation intent without a human looking at it? And what does privacy preserving really mean in this specific context?
Right, good questions. It means the researchers themselves never see the raw, potentially sensitive content of the chats. The pipeline they built does a few things. First, it tokenizes the messages, breaks them down, and encrypts them, protects the content. Then, they use a separate, specially trained LLM classifier. Think of it as a highly specialized model that's only taught one thing: identify the topic and the intent of the conversation. It does this based on structural patterns, syntactic features, word frequencies, but not the specific sensitive content details. So it can tell, for instance, this looks like someone asking for a recipe, or this looks like someone editing a business report, without ever needing to know the ingredients or the name of the company involved. This method allows for analysis at a massive scale while sticking to really strict privacy protocols.
Fascinating. Okay, that makes sense. So once they categorized all these conversations using that method, what did they find about the split between work usage and non-work usage?
Well, remember that prevailing economic narrative. It pretty much assumed AI exists primarily to automate or enhance tasks we do in the workplace for our jobs. The data just flatly contradicted that. It showed that non-work-related messages actually grew far, far faster. Look at the change in the share. In June 2024, about 53% of messages were classified as non-work related. Still the majority, but close. By June 2025, just 1 year later, that climbed dramatically. Over 70% of all usage was classified as non-work.
Over 70%. Okay, that's not just a small surprise. That fundamentally changes how economists need to think about the value proposition of these LLMs, doesn't it? If the vast majority of usage is personal, happening outside of paid work, then the impact on, say, home production, personal learning, just consumer life in general, it must be on a similar scale, maybe even larger than the gains we see in paid work.
It absolutely implies a huge amount of consumer surplus. The source material actually references some other studies, choice experiments, that tried to estimate this value. They estimated the consumer surplus that's a value users get beyond what they might pay for the service from generative AI usage was at least $97 billion, just in the U.S., just in 2024.
$97 billion. Okay, for our listeners, can you just clarify what that figure really signifies? What does that $97 billion represent?
Right. So since ChatGPT, the basic version at least, is largely free to use, standard economic metrics like GDP per worker, they often miss the value it creates. Consumer surplus tries to measure that perceived utility, the benefit the user gets. So for example, if ChatGPT helps you, I don't know, learn a new skill for a hobby, or write a really complex email to your kid's school principal, or maybe plan a detailed family vacation in half the time it would normally take, the value of that time saved, or the utility you gain from that better outcome, is often far greater than the $0 you actually paid for the tool. So that $97 billion estimate, it's basically the minimum value Americans themselves seem to assign to that improved efficiency and effectiveness in their non-work lives. It's like finding billions of dollars worth of free time and expert assistance.
That flexibility, that customization in a personal context, that really seems to be the engine driving this massive growth then. So let's break down that 70% non-work usage. What are the dominant conversation topics? What are people actually talking about?
Yeah, we can focus on what the paper calls the big three. These three categories together account for almost 80% of all consumer conversations. They are practical guidance, seeking information, and writing.
Okay, practical guidance. You said that's the most common single use case. What does that category actually cover?
Right. Practical guidance holds a pretty stable share, around 29% of overall usage. And this is where users are really seeking customized adaptive help, interactive help. It covers things like getting personalized how-to advice, maybe developing fitness or health plans, brainstorming creative ideas for personal projects, and really prominently it includes tutoring and teaching activities. What's critical here is that this isn't just passive information consumption like reading a web page. It's about custom interaction. The advice is tailored to the user's specific needs, their situation, their level of knowledge.
And you mentioned we have specific data on that educational component. That seems huge.
Yes, it's massive. Tutoring or teaching, as a subcategory, accounts for 10.2% of all messages sent to ChatGPT, which means it makes up over a third, 36% of that entire practical guidance category. So this strongly confirms that education, personalized instruction, maybe rapid skill acquisition, that's a key high-volume consumer use case. People are using it to learn.
Okay. Next up was seeking information. You said that one's been growing the fastest.
That's right. Seeking information, which covers things like looking up facts, finding recipes, checking current events, just general research, was the fastest growing category. It jumped from about 14% of all usage in mid-2024 up to 24% by mid-2025. A huge leap. This really shows a rapid, pretty aggressive substitution effect happening. People are replacing traditional web search with the chatbot, especially for factual queries where they seem to prioritize getting a direct, synthesized answer rather than just a list of links to sort through.
Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and finally, writing. I know you mentioned its share declined a bit, but it's still critical, right?
Yeah, its share went down from around 36% to 24% over that year, but that's still nearly a quarter of all usage, so it remains incredibly important. This category includes things like automated text production, editing, summarizing, translating text. But, and this is a really critical nuance we absolutely cannot miss, it's the type of writing request that's most common.
Okay, let's focus on that detail then. Is it mostly about the AI generating brand new text from scratch? Or is it more about modifying text the user provides?
It's modification, overwhelmingly. The analysis found that about two-thirds, roughly 66% of all messages categorized as writing are actually requests to modify text that the user has already provided. Things like, can you edit this paragraph for clarity, or critique the tone of this email, or summarize this long document I pasted in, or translate this for me. Only about one-third of writing requests are asking the AI to create totally new text from a blank prompt.
Wow. Okay, that is a profound distinction, isn't it? It means that even when people use the LLM for writing, they mostly see it as like an editorial co-pilot, something that enhances the quality and clarity of their own thinking and writing process, rather than just using it as some kind of disposable content generator to replace their effort entirely.
Exactly. It suggests the user really values the ability to iterate on their work, to refine it efficiently. The LLM acts like an instant, personalized editor. It helps bridge that often difficult gap between what you intend to say and getting it down in a polished, effective way. And that applies both at work and, clearly from the dominance of non-work usage, very much at home, too.
Okay, let's just briefly touch on the low-share use cases you mentioned,
Sure.
because they do seem to contradict a lot of the initial hype or market excitement. First, coding.
Right, coding, or messages related to computer programming. These account for only 4.2% of all ChatGPT messages in this dataset, which is, honestly, surprisingly small, especially considering how much attention LLMs get in developer communities and how often they're talked about as programmer assistants.
And you mentioned this contrast with data from other sources.
It does seem to. Some more specialized models, maybe those offered by companies specifically targeting developers, they often report much higher percentages of coding-related usage. The low number here is likely a function of ChatGPT's massive, generalized consumer user base. The typical user just isn't a professional programmer trying to debug code all day.
Yeah.
For the average person using it, it seems the value of getting personalized advice on, say, planning a trip, practical guidance, or understanding a news event, seeking information, simply outweighs the need for coding assistance.
Okay. And second, that whole area around emotional use, companionship, therapy, that sort of thing.
Yeah, the data shows that usage for things categorized as relationships and personal reflection is only about 1.9%, and use for games or role play is even smaller, just 0.4%. So while these areas definitely received significant media attention, maybe driven by science fiction ideas about AI becoming companions, this internal data strongly suggests that for the vast majority of users, these emotional, therapeutic, or companionship functions are relatively small, maybe niche applications within the overall consumer landscape. The primary value people are getting seems to be cognitive and functional, helping them think, learn, and do things.
That sets the stage perfectly then for what seems like the most critical classification system the researchers developed, user intent, categorizing messages as asking, doing, or expressing. Tell us about that.
Yes, this is really crucial for understanding the true economic function the LLM is serving for people. They defined asking as basically seeking information, advice, or counsel in order to inform a decision the user needs to make. Doing was defined as requesting the model to produce some kind of tangible output or perform a specific task like write this email, generate a summary, translate this text. And expressing was sort of the catch-all for general chit-chat, unstructured conversation, maybe expressing opinions without a clear request for action or information.
Okay, so what's the overall split between those three intents?
Overall, across all messages, it came out as 49% asking, 40% doing, and about 11% expressing. So nearly half is asking. But the trend over time is the real story here. Asking messages are actually growing faster than doing messages. And furthermore, when the researchers looked at the quality of these interactions, they had classifiers rate conversations as good or bad based on things like coherence and helpfulness. They found that asking messages consistently received a higher quality rating, a better good to bad ratio generated by their classifier models.
Okay, this is where it gets really, really significant for understanding the value, right? Users are getting more satisfaction, more perceived value when they treat the LLM more like an advisor, a thinking partner, rather than just a substitute worker to offload tasks onto. They value the decision support more than the automated task completion.
Precisely. And just to illustrate the difference really clearly, a doing query would be something like, write a 5-paragraph email summarizing the Q3 sales report. That's pure task automation. Get this done for me. An asking query, on the other hand, might be more like, okay, looking at this Q3 sales report data, maybe pasted in, what are the 3 most critical takeaways I should highlight to maximize stakeholder buy-in? And how should I structure an email that actually motivates the sales team rather than just reporting the dry data? See the difference. Asking queries are much more strategic. They're about understanding, judgment, communication strategy. And these asking queries were heavily correlated with those high-value use cases like practical guidance and complex seeking information. It really validates this idea that users see the LLM as a flexible, adaptive resource for tackling complex problems and, crucially, refining their own personal and professional strategy.
Okay, so now let's shift focus specifically to work-related usage, which, as you said, while it's only about 30% of the total message volume, is still where most of the traditional economic attention, the productivity discussions, are currently focused. So if we isolate the sample and look only at work-related messages, does that preference for asking still hold? Or does the workplace need for concrete outputs, for getting things done, tilt the balance back towards doing?
Yeah, that's a key point of differentiation they found. When you restrict the analysis just to messages classified as work-related, the pattern does flip slightly. Doing becomes slightly more common, accounting for about 56% of work messages, compared to asking at 35%. Which, when you think about it, makes perfect sense, right? Work often requires tangible outputs. You need the report written, the email sent, the code snippet generated, the documentation drafted. There's a bias towards production.
Okay, and within that work sphere, what specific tasks dominate? Is it still writing?
Yes, writing remains the undisputed king of work-related usage. It accounts for 40% of all work messages overall. And interestingly, for people in higher level positions like management and business occupations, writing actually exceeds 50% of their work-related messages. This really underscores the LLM's primary value proposition in the workplace right now. Its unique ability to generate, modify, and refine those long-form digital outputs that are pretty much the currency of modern knowledge work.
Right. Now let's talk about who is actually using it for work.
Right.
Are these benefits kind of filtering down equally across all job types, all wage brackets, all skill levels? Or is this primarily proving to be a tool for the highly educated, maybe the white-collar elite?
The data here is pretty unequivocal, actually. Educated users specifically, those holding bachelor's and graduate degrees, and also those working in highly paid professional occupations, are substantially more likely to use ChatGPT for work purposes. Just to give you a comparison, only about 40% of the messages coming from users identified as being in non-professional occupations were classified as work-related. Compare that to 57% for users in computer-related occupations, and you see similar high percentages for fields like management and engineering. There's a clear correlation with education and professional status.
Okay, but within those knowledge-intensive, highly paid jobs, does that preference for strategic asking for advisory support, for decision help, does that reappear? Or do they mostly use it for doing tasks too?
Yes, it reappears strongly. And this, I think, is the most critical finding when we talk about economic value creation in the workplace. Highly educated users and those in professional occupations, especially fields like computer science, general science, management, they are significantly more likely to use the LLM for asking messages when they're using it for work. For example, in computer-related occupations, 47% of their work messages were asking messages, seeking advice, information for decisions. Compare that to only 32% asking messages for users in non-professional occupations.
Okay, so let me see if I'm getting this right. If you're a high-value knowledge worker, someone paid primarily to make complex strategic decisions, you primarily use the LLM to improve your inputs, your process, your strategy. You use it to ask better questions, get customized advice, explore options. Whereas if you're in a perhaps more routine, non-professional job, you might use it more often just to automate a relatively simple output, to do a task more quickly.
That is precisely the pattern the data supports. It really suggests that the higher the cognitive load, the complexity, the decision-making component of the job, the more the user relies on the LLM for decision support rather than just pure replacement or automation of existing tasks. And to make this more rigorous, to formalize it, the researchers used the ONNET classification system.
Right, ONNET. That sounds like a technical term we should probably clarify for listeners.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly is WONET, and how does it help bridge that gap between looking at a chat message and understanding what job function it relates to?
Okay, yeah. ONNET stands for the Occupational Information Network. It's a really comprehensive classification system that was developed by the U.S. Department of Labor. And what it does is classify thousands of jobs based on their detailed requirements. Things like the specific skills needed, the knowledge areas involved, and crucially for this study, the generalized work activities, or GWAs, that make up the job. So what the researchers essentially did was train their classifiers not just to identify the topic, like writing, but to map the content of a work-related conversation, say someone asking for help, reviewing a complex legal document for inconsistencies, onto an official ONET GWA category, like obtaining, documenting, and interpreting information. And this step is really vital because it moves the analysis beyond just simple categories like writing or coding. It gets us closer to understanding the actual function the LLM is serving within the context of different occupations. What part of the job is it actually helping with?
Okay, got it. So using this ONNET lens, looking at those functions, what were the most common functions the LLM was performing across various professional jobs?
Well, the majority of the work usage, when mapped to ONET, clustered around two broad, high-level functions. And these are functions often cited as being among the hardest and also the most valuable parts of knowledge work. The first major function was obtaining, documenting, and interpreting information, gathering and making sense of data. And the second one was making decisions, giving advice, solving problems, and thinking creatively, the core cognitive stuff. But what was truly remarkable, according to the paper, was the similarity they found across different, highly paid professional occupations. That second category, making decisions and solving problems, consistently ranked in the top 2 GWAs for nearly every single professional group they tracked. That includes managers, engineers, scientists, you name it. Which means that fundamentally, regardless of whether your specific job involves, say, building a bridge or managing a marketing team, the LLM is being heavily used to enhance that core cognitive function of problem solving and decision making, not just, drafting routine emails faster.
So if we really connect this to the bigger picture, it strongly supports that whole theory of the LLM acting more like a co-pilot or maybe a decision advisor, rather than strictly being a coworker replacement that just comes in and performs existing tasks exactly as a human would.
Absolutely. That's the core conclusion the researchers draw regarding work usage. The LLM seems to improve worker output primarily by providing superior instantaneous decision support. And this capability is particularly valuable in those knowledge-intensive jobs where the quality of your strategic thinking, your judgment, your decision-making, that's the primary driver of your productivity and value. So the LLM isn't just automating the low-level operational tasks. It's actually enhancing human problem-solving capacity at a higher level.
Right. It makes the human manager or the engineer or the writer better at the core, complex parts of their job. By providing rapid analysis, customized insights, information synthesis on demand, and that efficiency gain, that enhancement of high-stakes knowledge work. That's where the researchers seem to locate the core and potentially massive economic value of this technology in the workplace. Hashtag tag outro down. Wow, okay, this internal data really provides a fascinating, incredibly objective, and just granular picture of this LLM revolution, doesn't it? It feels like it sweeps away so much of the initial conjecture and guesswork. Let's finish up with a final synthesis, a quick recap of the, 8 major facts documented by this groundbreaking paper. Okay, first, non-work use absolutely dominates and is growing faster. It now accounts for over 70% of consumer messages. This challenges those traditional productivity narratives and implies, massive consumer surplus value.
Second, the big three uses practical guidance, writing, and seeking information together account for nearly 80% of all queries. This confirms that generalized cognitive assistance, helping people think and do things across all aspects of life, is the primary driver of adoption.
Third, writing is indeed the top work use case. But critically, the majority of those requests, about two-thirds, are focused on editing, critiquing, and modifying existing text. This highlights its role more as an editorial co-pilot, enhancing user work rather than just a blank page creator.
Fourth, asking that is, seeking strategic guidance and advice for decisions is growing faster overall than doing tasks. And importantly, asking messages are rated as having higher quality by users, or at least by the classifiers interpreting quality. This points decisively towards the perceived value of decision support over pure automation.
Fifth, that early, really massive gender gap in usage. It closed dramatically, reaching almost perfect parity by mid-2025 as the LLM's utility broadened beyond its initial tech-heavy focus.
Sixth, usage is still heavily concentrated among younger adults. Nearly half of all messages come from users under the age of 26. This really solidifies this as a technology primarily being driven by the digitally native generation.
Seventh, adoption is growing fastest in low and middle-income countries. This strongly suggests the LLM is acting as a powerful democratizing force, improving global access to information, expertise, and learning.
And eighth, highly educated professionals use ChatGPT more often for work. And crucially, within those high-value jobs, they rely significantly more on asking messages and decision support functions, mapping directly onto those core RONET categories of high-level problem-solving and creative thinking.
Okay, so the overriding key takeaway here for you, the learner listening to this, seems to be this. The value of ChatGPT, as revealed by this massive internal data set, is overwhelmingly rooted in its role as a flexible, customized advisor and research assistant. It's fundamentally improving both personal and professional decision-making. It appears to be a powerful tool for helping us think better, not just for doing existing tasks faster or cheaper.
And this, I think, raises a really powerful final question, something to think about. Building on that finding that the global adult population is rapidly turning to an LLM. Not primarily to automate tasks, but to receive customized guidance, tutoring, and advice, that whole asking category. So if we are really witnessing the hyper-democratization of customized expertise and cognitive support, making high-quality advice almost instant and ubiquitous, what does this fundamental shift mean for the future of our traditional institutions? The ones built precisely on providing information and expertise. Think about formal education, journalism, maybe even personal counseling or coaching. If high-quality personalized advice becomes instantly available and virtually free, how must these established human institutions adapt? How do they maintain their essential relevance and value in this new landscape? It's definitely something for you to mull over as you integrate this new massive data set into your own understanding of the emerging AI economy.
That's all the time we have to this deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive into the sources.